September 1st, 1942 marked the day when Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann pressed his back against the frozen remnants of a brick factory wall, watching his breath crystallize in the Russian air. The city before him burned with a hunger that consumed everything: buildings, hope, men. Stalingrad had become something beyond a battlefield. It had transformed into a graveyard that refused to fill. Wilhelm had joined the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus with dreams of swift victory, echoing the propaganda that promised German soldiers would be home by Christmas. Those promises now seemed like cruel jokes whispered by ghosts. The factory district where his unit had taken position stretched before him like the broken teeth of some ancient monster, each shattered window and collapsed wall telling stories of violence that would never be recorded in official histories. The morning brought with it the sound that had become familiar: the Katyusha rockets screaming overhead, Stalin's organs playing their symphony of death. Wilhelm watched as Gefreiter Klaus Becker, a farmer's son from Bavaria, checked his Kar 98 rifle for the 100th time that hour. Klaus had stopped talking 3 days ago, after watching his closest friend disappear into the Volga's icy embrace during a failed crossing attempt. According to documentation from the German Federal Archives, the Sixth Army had expected urban combat, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the house-to-house brutality that Stalingrad demanded. The Soviet defenders fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. For every building the Germans captured, they paid in blood that stained the snow black. Wilhelm remembered Hauptmann Ernst Fischer, their company commander, reading aloud from a letter sent by General Paulus himself, assuring them that supplies would arrive, that relief was coming, that the Führer had not forgotten them. Fischer's hands had trembled as he read, not from cold, but from the knowledge that these words were beautiful lies. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and Wilhelm's unit had not received proper winter clothing. The Quartermaster Corps had promised deliveries that never materialized, lost somewhere in the vast expanses between Germany and this cursed city. Men wrapped themselves in anything they could scavenge: Soviet coats stripped from corpses, newspapers stuffed into boots, rags bound around frost-bitten fingers that could barely pull triggers. Wilhelm thought of his younger brother, Hans, who served with the 4th Panzer Army somewhere to the south. Their mother had written letters addressed to both sons, delivered through the military postal system that somehow continued functioning despite the chaos. In her last letter, she had mentioned the apple trees in their village, how they had bloomed late that year, and how she prayed for her boys every night. Wilhelm kept that letter folded inside his helmet, a fragile connection to a world that felt increasingly like a dream. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt crawled alongside Wilhelm, his face bearing the gray pallor of malnutrition. The supply situation had deteriorated beyond critical. Rations had been cut to a single piece of bread per day, supplemented by whatever horses could be slaughtered. Otto whispered that he had heard rumors of Luftwaffe transport planes attempting drops, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire made such operations nearly suicidal. As darkness settled over Stalingrad, Wilhelm Hoffmann closed his eyes and wondered if he would see another dawn. November 19th, 1942 arrived with the thunder of Soviet artillery that shook the very foundations of the earth. Wilhelm Hoffmann woke to chaos. Men screaming, running, the world itself seeming to tilt on its axis. Operation Uranus had begun, though the German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad would not learn its name until much later, if they survived at all. The Soviet counteroffensive struck with a precision that caught the Wehrmacht completely unprepared. Romanian Third Army positions to the northwest collapsed within hours, their defensive lines overwhelmed by waves of T-34 tanks and countless infantry divisions that seemed to emerge from the frozen steppe like vengeful spirits. To the south, the 4th Panzer Army faced similar devastation as Soviet forces punched through weakened defensive positions held by Romanian Fourth Army units. Hauptmann Fischer gathered what remained of his company in the basement of their factory stronghold. Wilhelm counted 23 men, where once there had been over 100. Fischer's voice remained steady as he explained their situation, though his eyes betrayed the horror of understanding. The Soviets had encircled the entire Sixth Army, over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, now trapped in a pocket measuring roughly 30 miles across. Wilhelm watched as Klaus Becker finally spoke after his days of silence. The farmer's son asked the question everyone feared to voice. Would they be allowed to break out? Fischer shook his head slowly. Orders from Führer headquarters were absolute. Hold Stalingrad at all costs. No retreat. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had personally promised Hitler that his air force could supply the trapped army entirely by air. The Hauptmann did not need to say what everyone already knew. This was impossible. The days that followed blurred into an endless nightmare of cold, hunger, and desperate defensive actions. Soviet forces tightened their grip around the pocket systematically, reducing German-held territory block by bloody block. Wilhelm's unit withdrew from their factory position on November 26 after Soviet assault groups infiltrated through the sewers, emerging behind German lines like demons rising from hell itself. Feldwebel Schmidt had been wounded during the withdrawal, a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round embedded in his shoulder. Without proper medical facilities, the wound festered, and Wilhelm could smell the infection long before Otto admitted the pain had become unbearable. The field hospital, such as it existed, consisted of a partially collapsed school building where doctors performed amputations without anesthesia, their instruments sterilized in melted snow. According to records maintained by the German War Graves Commission, documented in numerous historical accounts including those by British historian Anthony Beevor, the conditions within the Stalingrad pocket deteriorated with terrifying speed. Daily Luftwaffe supply drops fell far short of the minimum 500 tons needed to sustain the trapped army. On good days, transports delivered 70 tons. Most days brought far less. Wilhelm received his last letter from home on December 8th. His mother wrote about Christmas preparations, about preserving what food she could, about prayers for peace. She did not know that her sons were both trapped in Stalingrad now. Hans's 4th Panzer Army unit had been caught in the encirclement while attempting to reinforce the city. Wilhelm folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others, a collection of paper ghosts from a life that felt increasingly distant. The horses had all been slaughtered and eaten by mid-December. Men chewed on leather belts and boiled bones to extract any remaining nutrition. Wilhelm watched soldiers trade wedding rings and watches for crusts of bread, bartering away pieces of their former lives for a few more hours of existence. Some simply stopped fighting the cold and hunger, lying down in the snow to embrace death with an almost peaceful resignation. Hauptmann Fischer received orders to defend a warehouse complex near the Volga's edge. The building had been bombed so many times that its walls resembled Swiss cheese, offering protection from wind but little else. On Christmas Eve 1942, Fischer gathered his remaining men. Wilhelm counted 11 survivors from the original company and read from a small Bible he carried in his coat. The Hauptmann's voice cracked as he read about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Outside, Soviet artillery continued its relentless barrage. Wilhelm thought about his brother Hans, somewhere else in this frozen hell, and prayed they might both survive to see home again. The prayer felt hollow even as he formed it, a desperate plea cast into an indifferent universe that had already demonstrated its cruelty. The loss of Pitomnik meant the Sixth Army's lifeline had been severed. Only one small airstrip remained at Gumrak, and even that lay within easy range of Soviet artillery. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple. Without food, medicine, or ammunition resupply, the trapped army would cease to exist within weeks. General Paulus sent increasingly desperate messages to Army Group headquarters, begging for permission to attempt a breakout. Each request received the same response. Hold positions. Relief is coming. The Führer forbids surrender. Wilhelm's unit had withdrawn to positions near the Red Square in Stalingrad's center, a district so thoroughly destroyed that distinguishing one ruin from another had become impossible. Klaus Becker had died 3 days earlier, not from enemy fire but from typhus, one of countless soldiers claimed by disease as the pocket's sanitation systems completely collapsed. Bodies could not be buried in the frozen earth, so they accumulated in courtyards and basements, monuments to futility. Hauptmann Fischer had been promoted to acting battalion commander after his superior officer suffered a complete mental breakdown, found wandering through the rubble speaking to soldiers who had died weeks before. The promotion meant nothing. Fischer commanded fewer than 40 men from a battalion that should have numbered over 800. He gathered them in what remained of a department store, its grand staircases now leading nowhere, its display windows long since blown out. The Hauptmann spoke plainly without the propaganda that had characterized earlier briefings. The Sixth Army was dying. Soviet forces had split the pocket into 2 separate sections, north and south, preventing any coordinated defense. Ammunition stocks had dwindled to the point where soldiers were issued 5 rounds per day. Artillery batteries fell silent, their guns useless without shells. Tank crews abandoned their vehicles when fuel ran out, becoming infantry in a battle where numbers had ceased to matter. Wilhelm listened as Fischer described Soviet surrender offers. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in German, promising food, medical care, and eventual repatriation for those who laid down their arms. The propaganda claimed that Germany had already lost the war, that continued resistance served no purpose. Fischer did not comment on the truthfulness of these claims. He simply reminded his men that captured German soldiers faced uncertain fates in Soviet hands. Historical documentation from the Soviet archives, later revealed after the Cold War, showed that Stalin's forces had indeed prepared prisoner-of-war camps, though conditions there would prove nearly as deadly as the Stalingrad pocket itself. Of approximately 91,000 German soldiers eventually captured, only about 6,000 would survive to return home, most not until the mid-1950s. On January 22nd, Gumrak airfield fell to Soviet assault. The last connection to the outside world had been cut. Wilhelm watched as wounded soldiers, men who had been promised evacuation, stared at the sky where transport planes no longer appeared. Some wept. Others laughed with the hysteria of those who had moved beyond despair into a realm where emotions ceased to have meaning. Wilhelm had no answer. He closed Otto's eyes and took his identification tags, adding them to a collection he had gathered from fallen comrades. Someday, if he survived, he would find these men's families and tell them their sons, husbands, and fathers had not died as heroes, but as abandoned pawns in a game played by men who would never face consequences for their decisions. Hauptmann Fischer assembled his remaining soldiers on January 25th. 17 men stood before him, ghosts wrapped in rags, their eyes hollow with starvation and frostbite. The Hauptmann read aloud the latest message from Führer headquarters. The Sixth Army had been elevated to a symbol of German resistance. Their sacrifice would inspire the nation. They must fight to the last man and last bullet. Fischer folded the paper carefully, then tore it into pieces that scattered in the winter wind. He looked at his men and spoke the words that would have earned him execution had any superior officers remained alive to hear them. The war was over for them. They had fought beyond all reasonable expectation. What came next was each man's choice: continue fighting for a cause that had already abandoned them, or seek survival through whatever means possible. Wilhelm Hoffmann thought about his brother Hans, about his mother's letters now turned to ash for kindling, about Klaus Becker and Otto Schmidt and all the others who would never go home. He checked his rifle and found 3 rounds remaining. January 30th, 1943, marked the 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power, a date that had once been celebrated throughout Germany with parades and speeches. In the Stalingrad pocket, the anniversary brought only death dressed in gray uniforms. Wilhelm Hoffmann watched as Hauptmann Fischer was killed by a Soviet sniper's bullet. The shot so precise it entered through the officer's left eye, ending him instantly without time for final words. The company, now reduced to 12 men, had no one to assume command. Military hierarchy had ceased to function in any meaningful way. General Paulus himself had retreated to a basement headquarters in the Univermag department store, where he sent his last messages to Berlin with a fatalism that bordered on poetry. The Sixth Army had been divided, conquered, and now existed only as scattered pockets of resistance measuring blocks rather than miles. Wilhelm found himself leading the survivors not through any formal promotion, but simply because he remained capable of making decisions when others had surrendered to the apathy of the dying. They occupied the ruins of a theater. Its stage collapsed into the orchestra pit, its seats serving as fuel for fires that provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin froze within minutes. On January 31st, orders arrived that General Paulus had been promoted to Field Marshal by personal decree of the Führer. The message included a pointed historical note. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear, a command disguised as an honor. Paulus should take his own life rather than face capture. According to documents later recovered by Soviet forces and detailed in numerous historical accounts, including William Craig's comprehensive work, Enemy at the Gates, Paulus refused this final order, choosing survival over suicide. Wilhelm learned of Paulus's surrender through Soviet loudspeakers that blared the news across the frozen ruins. The southern pocket of the Sixth Army had capitulated. The field marshal himself had been captured alive, along with his staff. For the German soldiers still fighting in the northern pocket, this announcement carried a significance beyond words. If their commanding general had surrendered, what purpose remained in continued resistance? The 12 survivors in Wilhelm's theater refuge discussed their options through the night of February 1st. Some argued for fighting to the end, honoring their oaths as soldiers. Others pointed out that their oaths had been to officers who had abandoned them, to a regime that had sacrificed them for propaganda value. The debate never reached conclusion because Soviet infantry surrounded the building at dawn on February 2, 1943. Wilhelm remembered standing in the theater's destroyed lobby, his empty rifle in his hands as Soviet soldiers entered with weapons raised. A young lieutenant, probably no older than Wilhelm himself, shouted commands in Russian that needed no translation. Wilhelm set down his weapon and raised his hands, watching as his comrades did the same. The act of surrender felt simultaneously like defeat and liberation, the end of one nightmare and potentially the beginning of another. The German soldiers were herded into the street where thousands of others already stood in ragged columns. Wilhelm searched the faces for any sign of his brother Hans, but found only strangers, men who had become indistinguishable from one another through suffering. Soviet guards moved among them, separating wounded from healthy, though these categories had become relative. Every survivor bore wounds of some kind, visible or otherwise. A Soviet officer addressed the assembled prisoners in broken German, explaining they would march to collection points for processing and eventual transport to prisoner of war camps. He assured them they would receive food and medical treatment. Wilhelm noticed the officer's carefully neutral expression, neither cruel nor kind, the face of a man doing an unpleasant job. Later historical research, documented by German POW survivors and Soviet records, would reveal that approximately 60% of German prisoners taken at Stalingrad died during the first few months of captivity from disease, starvation, and untreated wounds. Wilhelm joined the march east into captivity. Behind him, Stalingrad burned itself out, the fires finally consuming what little remained to fuel them. The battle had lasted 5 months, 1 week, and 3 days. Estimates of casualties varied wildly, but conservative figures suggested nearly 2 million military and civilian dead, wounded, or captured. The city that had borne Stalin's name had become a charnel house whose horrors would echo through history. Wilhelm had lost track of how many days had passed since the surrender. Time had become fluid, measured only by the rhythm of walking and the periodic distribution of a thin soup that barely deserved the name. The Soviet guards showed neither particular cruelty nor mercy. They were simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of processing 91,000 prisoners through a system unprepared for such numbers. The column stopped at a village whose name Wilhelm never learned. The prisoners were herded into barns and warehouses, packed so tightly that men slept standing up, supported by the bodies pressed against them. Wilhelm found himself next to an older Unteroffizier named Friedrich Müller, a veteran who had fought in the First World War and lived to see history repeat its horrors with even greater enthusiasm. Friedrich spoke in a whisper about probability and survival. He had observed patterns in the Soviet selection process. Those who could work received better rations, while the wounded and sick were separated into what guards called hospitals, but which Friedrich suspected were simply places to die away from witnesses. The old soldier advised Wilhelm to hide any injuries, to appear strong even when weakness threatened to overwhelm him, to volunteer for work details no matter how brutal they seemed. Historical records from Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s and analyzed by scholars including historian Richard Overy revealed that Stalin's regime focused initial interrogation efforts on identifying officers and political commissars for separate processing. Enlisted men like Wilhelm were generally treated as resources, potential labor for reconstruction efforts that would last years beyond the war's conclusion. Wilhelm was assigned to a work battalion in early March, transported by railcar to a camp near Krasnogorsk outside Moscow. The journey took 5 days in unheated cattle cars where men froze to the wooden floors overnight. Wilhelm survived by positioning himself in the middle of the mass of bodies, using his fellow prisoners as insulation against the deadly cold. 18 men in his car died during transit, their corpses removed at the destination like cargo that had spoiled. Krasnogorsk camp housed approximately 3,000 German prisoners in barracks designed for half that number. The Soviet administrators maintained strict organization, morning roll calls, work details, political re-education sessions where prisoners learned about Marxist theory and the evils of fascism. Wilhelm attended these sessions in a daze, his mind focused entirely on the mathematics of survival. Food rations at Krasnogorsk consisted of 600 grams of black bread daily, supplemented by soup and occasional portions of salted fish. This represented starvation levels for men performing heavy labor, but it exceeded what Wilhelm had consumed during Stalingrad's final weeks. His body, pushed beyond normal limits for so long, struggled to process even this meager sustenance. Dysentery swept through the camp regularly, killing men who had survived combat only to succumb to disease. Wilhelm worked in a lumber detail, cutting trees in forests outside the camp perimeter. The labor was backbreaking, conducted in temperatures that remained below freezing even as spring approached. Guards watched the prisoners with machine guns, though Wilhelm noted that few attempted escape. Where would they go? They were hundreds of miles inside Soviet territory, wearing clothes marked with painted stripes identifying them as POWs, unable to speak Russian beyond basic phrases. In April, Wilhelm received his first letter from home. The Red Cross had somehow maintained communications between Germany and the POW camps, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. His mother wrote that she had received notification that Wilhelm was alive and in Soviet custody. She made no mention of Hans. Wilhelm read between the lines and understood. His younger brother had not survived Stalingrad. The knowledge settled over him like ice water, cold and heavy and suffocating. Friedrich Müller died in May of 1943, his heart simply stopping one morning as he prepared for the day's work detail. Wilhelm had grown close to the old soldier, finding in Friedrich's cynical wisdom a model for how to navigate captivity without losing oneself entirely. Friedrich's last words to Wilhelm had been about perspective. Every day survived was a small victory. Every morning waking up meant you had won another battle against odds designed to kill you. The work continued through summer and into autumn. Wilhelm learned to pace himself, to conserve energy, to trade scraps for small advantages. He developed a reputation as reliable, someone who could be counted on to complete assigned tasks without complaint. This reputation earned him slightly larger rations and assignment to less brutal work details, advantages that meant the difference between life and death. Wilhelm celebrated his 23rd birthday in September 1943 by receiving an extra portion of soup. He thought about how much life he had already lived, how many deaths he had witnessed, how the boy who had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of glory had been replaced by this hollow-eyed man who counted survival in days rather than years. March 12, 1944 brought the first signs that the war beyond the camp's barbed wire continued with a ferocity that made Stalingrad seem almost quaint in retrospect. Wilhelm Hoffmann noticed changes in the guards' behavior, increased tension, more frequent radio communications, a general atmosphere of anticipation. Soviet authorities remained tight-lipped about military developments, but rumors spread through the camp with the speed of disease. Wilhelm had been transferred to a manufacturing facility outside Chelyabinsk in the Ural Mountains, where German POWs labored alongside Soviet workers to produce tank components. The factory operated around the clock, its furnaces never cooling, its assembly lines churning out metal destined for the front. Wilhelm worked 14-hour shifts 6 days per week, his hands developing calluses atop calluses, his body adapting to deprivation in ways he had not imagined possible. A new prisoner arrived in May, a young Gefreiter named Peter Schmidt from Hamburg, who had been captured during the retreat from Ukraine. Peter brought news from the outside world. The Allies had invaded France. Germany faced assault from both east and west. Cities burned under endless bombing campaigns. Wilhelm listened to these reports with detached interest. The war that had consumed his youth had become abstract, something happening to other people in distant places. Peter could not stop talking about Hamburg's destruction. According to accounts Peter had heard before his capture, British and American bombers had created firestorms in July 1943 that killed 40,000 civilians in a single week. Peter's family had lived in the Hammerbrook district, one of the areas completely incinerated. He had received no letters since his deployment, carried no certainty about whether his parents and sisters had survived. The uncertainty ate at him like acid. Wilhelm found himself becoming a mentor to Peter, repeating Friedrich Müller's lessons about survival. Focus on what you can control, your attitude, your work ethic, your relationships with other prisoners. Do not waste energy on what lies beyond your influence. The war's outcome, the decisions of distant commanders, the fate of loved ones. Survive this day, then the next, accumulating small victories until they sum to something approaching a life. According to documentation from the Soviet POW camp system, later studied by historians including specialists at the German Historical Institute, mortality rates among German prisoners began declining in 1944 as camp administrators realized they needed to preserve their workforce. Rations increased marginally, medical care improved from non-existent to barely adequate, and work quotas became slightly less impossible. These changes represented pragmatism rather than mercy. Dead prisoners provided no labor. Wilhelm received a letter from his mother in June 1944, the first communication in over a year. She wrote about persistent food shortages in Germany, about Allied bombing raids that forced her to shelter in basements, about the steady stream of casualty notices delivered throughout the village. She ended with words that haunted Wilhelm. I have already buried one son in my heart. Please God, let me keep one alive. The factory suffered an accident in August when a faulty pressure valve exploded, killing 2 Soviet workers and severely burning 3 German prisoners. Wilhelm witnessed the aftermath, watching as Soviet medics treated their own people first while the Germans waited with burns that blistered and wept. One of the German prisoners died during the night, his screams finally fading into silence as infection claimed him. The incident reminded Wilhelm that death remained close, requiring only momentary inattention to collect its due. Peter Schmidt attempted escape in September 1944, convinced he could somehow walk the 1,000 miles back to Germany. Guards caught him within 8 hours, brought him back to the camp, and executed him in front of the assembled prisoners as an example. Wilhelm watched Peter's body crumple from the firing squad's bullets and felt nothing. He had witnessed so many deaths that each new one added only incrementally to the weight he carried. Winter 1944 into 1945 brought rumors of German retreat on all fronts. Soviet guards spoke more openly about victories, about the Red Army's advance into Poland, about the coming invasion of Germany itself. Some prisoners celebrated these developments as signs the war would soon end, bringing release from captivity. Wilhelm remained skeptical. The Soviets had invested too much in their prisoner labor force to release it simply because peace arrived. Wilhelm turned 24 in September 1944 with no fanfare or acknowledgement. He had survived 3 years as a prisoner of war, outliving thousands who had marched into captivity alongside him. The achievement brought no satisfaction, only the grim determination to survive whatever came next. Friedrich Müller had been right. Every morning waking up constituted a small victory. The factory increased production quotas in early 1945 as Soviet forces pressed into Germany itself. Wilhelm worked until his hands bled, until exhaustion became a constant companion, until the line between sleeping and waking blurred into something resembling consciousness without awareness. His body operated on autopilot while his mind retreated to places the war could not reach. On May 8, 1945, Soviet administrators announced Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe had ended. Prisoners gathered in the barracks to discuss what this meant for them. Some believed immediate repatriation would follow. Others, Wilhelm among them, understood that peace changed nothing for men who had become economic assets. Wilhelm would remain in Soviet captivity for another 5 years, working in factories, mines, and reconstruction projects. His release would not come until 1950, by which time Germany had been divided. His mother had died without seeing him again, and the world he had known no longer existed. But that story belonged to a future Wilhelm could not yet imagine, as he stood in the factory yard, listening to Soviet authorities announce victory over fascism. October 27, 1945 found Wilhelm Hoffmann standing on a train platform in Sverdlovsk, watching autumn leaves scatter across empty tracks that stretched toward horizons obscured by industrial haze. 6 months had passed since Germany's surrender, yet Wilhelm remained a prisoner, transferred from the tank factory to a mining operation in the Urals, where German POWs extracted copper ore from tunnels that seemed determined to collapse and bury them. The mining camp housed approximately 2,000 prisoners, a mix of Wehrmacht soldiers, SS officers held separately under heavier guard, and a handful of Luftwaffe personnel captured during the war's final months. Soviet authorities had promised repatriation, always describing it as beginning soon, a word that had lost all meaning through endless repetition. Wilhelm had learned to ignore such promises, focusing instead on the immediate task of surviving shifts that extended 12 hours underground. The mine itself resembled something from medieval nightmares. Narrow shafts lit by flickering electric bulbs, air thick with dust that coated lungs and induced coughing fits that never fully subsided, constant danger of cave-ins that killed regularly enough to keep mortality statistics carefully obscured. Wilhelm worked in a crew led by a former Obergefreiter named Martin Bauer, a Berliner whose dark humor provided the group's only entertainment. Martin had perfected the art of appearing busy while actually conserving energy, a skill he taught Wilhelm and the others. Soviet overseers cared about quota fulfillment, not the methods used to achieve it. By careful calculation of effort and strategic placement of extracted ore, Martin's crew consistently met targets while avoiding the exhaustion that killed men who worked themselves to death trying to exceed expectations. Historical analysis conducted after the Cold War's conclusion revealed that Soviet authorities deliberately retained German prisoners for reconstruction purposes, viewing them as reparations in human form. Stalin's regime calculated that German labor could rebuild what German warfare had destroyed, a kind of justice that appealed to the Soviet leadership's sense of symmetry. Documentation from the Soviet Council of Ministers showed formal decisions to extend POW labor programs well beyond the war's conclusion. Wilhelm received no letters throughout 1945 and most of 1946. The Red Cross communication system that had functioned during wartime apparently could not adapt to peacetime complexities. Wilhelm existed in informational vacuum, knowing nothing of his mother's fate, his village's condition, or even which German government now administered what remained of his homeland. The absence of information became another form of imprisonment. A new prisoner arrived in March 1946, who brought Wilhelm news that hit harder than any physical blow. Martin Fischer mentioned meeting a soldier from Wilhelm's original unit who reported that Hans Hoffmann, Wilhelm's younger brother, had died during Stalingrad's final days. Wilhelm had known this intellectually since 1943, but hearing confirmation from someone who claimed to have witnessed Hans's death transformed abstract knowledge into concrete grief. Wilhelm found himself unable to sleep for 3 days following Fischer's revelation. He lay on his wooden bunk in the crowded barracks, staring at ceiling beams while his mind replayed memories of Hans, teaching his younger brother to fish in the stream near their village, watching Hans's excitement when receiving his military assignment, the pride in their mother's eyes as both sons wore uniforms, all of it rendered meaningless by frozen mud in a Russian city. The mine claimed 5 prisoners during a collapse in June 1946. Wilhelm had been working in an adjacent tunnel and heard the rumble, felt the ground shake, breathed the dust cloud that billowed through connecting passages. Martin Bauer led the rescue effort, but the trapped men died before they could be reached. Soviet authorities conducted no investigation, simply recorded the losses in logbooks and assigned replacement workers to fill the quota. Wilhelm turned 26 in September 1946 with the realization that he had now spent longer as a prisoner than he had served as a soldier. The war itself had become distant memory, something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. He could barely remember the Wilhelm Hoffmann who had believed in swift victory and righteous causes. That boy had died somewhere in Stalingrad's ruins, replaced by this hollow-eyed man who measured life in extracted ore quotas. Small improvements arrived gradually through 1947. Rations increased slightly as Soviet agriculture recovered from wartime devastation. Medical care became marginally more accessible, though still primitive by any reasonable standard. Camp administrators even organized a library where prisoners could access books in German, mostly Marxist theory and Soviet literature, but words nonetheless. Wilhelm read voraciously, filling empty hours with other people's stories. Martin Bauer died in February 1948, not from accident but from pneumonia that his weakened immune system could not fight. Wilhelm watched his friend deteriorate over 3 days, each breath becoming more labored, each coughing fit producing blood-flecked phlegm. Martin's last words mixed delirium with clarity. He spoke about Berlin cafes that no longer existed, family members likely dead, dreams deferred until they had atrophied completely. Wilhelm assumed leadership of Martin's work crew, applying lessons learned about balancing survival with productivity. The Soviet overseers accepted this transition without comment. Individual prisoners mattered less than aggregate output. One German replaced another in a system designed for efficiency rather than humanity. Wilhelm led his crew through 1948 and into 1949, years measured by tons of copper ore extracted and comrades buried in unmarked graves. The first concrete repatriation announcement came in May 1949. Soviet authorities informed prisoners that those deemed not guilty of war crimes would begin returning to Germany within 6 months. Wilhelm joined hundreds of others in medical examinations and political screenings, processes designed to identify who could safely be released. The examinations revealed what Wilhelm already knew. Years of malnutrition and brutal labor had destroyed his body, even as his will to survive remained unbroken. Wilhelm learned in August 1949 that his name appeared on a repatriation list scheduled for early 1950. The news brought no joy, only cautious acknowledgement that his imprisonment might actually end. He had learned to trust nothing until it materialized, to expect disappointment as the default outcome. 5 more months of mining stretched ahead, 5 more months of hoping the mountain would not decide to claim him before bureaucracy could set him free. January 20th, 1950 marked the day Wilhelm Hoffmann stepped onto a train platform in Frankfurt an der Oder, German soil beneath his feet for the first time in over 8 years. The journey from the Urals had taken 3 weeks, traveling in boxcars that differed little from those that had transported him east years earlier. Wilhelm traveled with 200 other repatriated prisoners, men who had become brothers through shared suffering. The processing center at Frankfurt an der Oder functioned with German efficiency that felt alien after years under Soviet administration. Officials registered each returning prisoner, recording details of service, capture, and imprisonment for records that would gather dust in government archives. Wilhelm moved through stations mechanically. Medical examination, delousing, issued civilian clothing that hung loose on his skeletal frame, assigned temporary housing in a displaced persons camp. The medical officer who examined Wilhelm noted severe malnutrition, probable tuberculosis, extensive scarring from frostbite, and tooth loss from scurvy. The physician wrote these observations in a file Wilhelm would never see, then cleared him for release with instructions to report to local health authorities. Treatment would come later, if resources allowed. Thousands of returning prisoners needed care that overwhelmed available medical infrastructure. Wilhelm received travel documents for his home village in Bavaria on January 25th. He boarded a train heading south through a Germany he no longer recognized. Cities he had known as vibrant centers of commerce now existed as rubble fields punctuated by temporary structures. Frankfurt lay shattered, its medieval center erased by bombing campaigns. Würzburg appeared even worse, entire districts reduced to foundations and scattered bricks. The other passengers on the train avoided looking directly at Wilhelm and the handful of other returning prisoners. The men wore their suffering visibly, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, bodies that moved with the careful deliberation of those who had learned to conserve every calorie. Wilhelm understood the avoidance. Germany wanted to forget the war, to rebuild without confronting the human costs that men like him represented. Wilhelm reached his village on January 28th, stepping off a local train onto a platform where he had said goodbye to his mother in 1941. The village appeared largely intact, spared the aerial bombardment that had destroyed larger cities, though occupation and privation had left their marks. Buildings needed paint, roads required repair, and the population seemed to consist primarily of women, children, and old men. He walked familiar streets that felt foreign, passing houses where neighbors he remembered had lived. Some recognized him, their faces registering shock at his appearance before they offered brief greetings and hurried away. Wilhelm understood their discomfort. He represented everything the village wanted to forget: the war, the losses, the shame of defeat. Wilhelm found his family's house at the village edge, a small structure with a garden his mother had tended for decades. A middle-aged woman answered his knock, introducing herself as his mother's cousin Maria. She had been living in the house since 1946. Maria's face showed pity as she delivered news Wilhelm had already prepared himself to receive. His mother had died in April 1945, 3 weeks before the war's end, killed when American artillery struck the village during the final Allied advance. Maria invited Wilhelm inside, serving him ersatz coffee and bread with margarine while explaining what had transpired. His mother had received notification of Wilhelm's capture in 1943, but never learned if he survived. She had mourned both sons, lighting candles in the village church every Sunday, praying for their souls. The artillery shell that killed her had struck directly, death instantaneous. Maria assured Wilhelm his mother had not suffered, a small mercy Wilhelm recognized as likely false comfort. The house contained few of his mother's possessions. Maria had sold most items for food during the immediate post-war period when currency meant less than goods. Wilhelm's childhood bedroom had been converted to storage, filled with the cousin's belongings. Maria offered to let Wilhelm stay temporarily while he determined his next steps, but both understood this arrangement could not last. The house belonged to Maria now through occupation, if not formal ownership. Wilhelm spent 3 days in the village visiting the cemetery where his mother lay buried beneath a simple marker that listed only her name and dates. No mention of her sons, the family line that had ended with their deaths in Russia. Wilhelm stood at the grave trying to feel grief or loss or anything beyond the emotional numbness that had become his default state. The tears would not come. He had used them all in Soviet camps. The village priest, Father Klaus, visited Wilhelm on his second day home. The elderly clergyman had baptized both Wilhelm and Hans, presided over their confirmations, blessed them before their deployment. Father Klaus looked a decade older than his actual years, aged by witnessing his congregation's destruction. The priest asked about Wilhelm's experiences with genuine concern, but Wilhelm found himself unable or unwilling to describe what he had endured. How could words convey Stalingrad? How could language capture 8 years of imprisonment? According to research conducted by German sociologists in subsequent decades and documented in works such as A Nation Under Our Feet by Stephen Osment, returning prisoners of war faced significant challenges reintegrating into post-war German society. Communities struggling with immediate survival had limited capacity to support traumatized veterans. Many former soldiers found themselves isolated, their experiences incomprehensible to civilians who had faced different but equally valid hardships. Wilhelm left the village on February 1, 1950. Maria gave him a small box containing his mother's wedding ring and a few letters his parents had exchanged during their courtship. Wilhelm accepted these with gratitude, packing them carefully in the bag authorities had provided. He boarded a train heading toward Frankfurt, toward displaced person services, toward whatever future existed for men like him. The journey brought Wilhelm through Nuremberg, where the famous trials of major war criminals had concluded 3 years earlier. Wilhelm stared at the Palace of Justice as the train passed, thinking about accountability and guilt. He had followed orders, fought where commanded, killed when necessary. Did that make him a criminal? He had no answer, only the knowledge that questioning orders in wartime meant execution. Wilhelm reached Frankfurt in early February and registered with occupation authorities who administered displaced persons programs. He joined thousands of others who had lost everything: homes, families, futures. The authorities assigned him temporary housing in a converted warehouse, provided minimal rations, and enrolled him in vocational training programs designed to help veterans transition to civilian employment. The training program taught basic carpentry, a trade Wilhelm had never considered but which offered employment prospects in a nation that needed to rebuild millions of destroyed structures. Wilhelm attended classes mechanically, learning to measure precisely, cut accurately, join securely. His hands, damaged by years of hard labor, struggled with fine motor control, but determination compensated for physical limitations. Wilhelm completed the carpentry program in June 1950 and found employment with a construction company rebuilding apartment blocks in Frankfurt's devastated districts. The work was honest labor that paid enough for room, board, and modest savings. Wilhelm rented a small apartment in a building his company had just completed, furnishing it minimally with items purchased from second-hand markets. The Korean War began that same June, news that reached Wilhelm through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Another conflict, another generation of young men marching toward trenches and bullets and frozen mud. Wilhelm read the reports with detachment, grateful only that Germany would not participate in this particular madness. The nation had been disarmed, divided, occupied, permitted to exist but not to threaten. Wilhelm established routines that gave structure to days that otherwise threatened to dissolve into meaninglessness. Work from 7 to 4, dinner at a local guest house, evenings spent reading in his apartment. He avoided forming close relationships, maintaining friendly distance from co-workers who sensed something damaged in him that defied easy companionship. Wilhelm existed rather than lived, moving through time without purpose beyond survival. September 15, 1951 found Wilhelm Hoffmann standing on scaffolding, 40 feet above Frankfurt streets, installing window frames in an apartment building rising from rubble that had once been someone's neighborhood. The construction site buzzed with activity. Welders, masons, electricians, all contributing to transformation of destruction into habitation. Wilhelm had been promoted to crew supervisor 6 months earlier. Recognition of skills developed through consistent performance. The city around him transformed daily. Frankfurt's reconstruction proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by Marshall Plan funds that poured into West Germany to create a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Cranes dotted the skyline, their movements choreographed to avoid collision while each pursued independent construction projects. The economic miracle that would define post-war Germany had begun, though Wilhelm felt disconnected from the optimism that energized younger workers. His crew consisted of 7 men, a mix of veterans like himself and younger workers who had been too young for military service. Wilhelm managed them with quiet competence, giving clear instructions and ensuring safety protocols were followed. The younger workers sometimes asked about his experiences during the war, questions Wilhelm deflected with vague responses that satisfied curiosity without providing actual information. The past remained locked in places words could not access. Wilhelm had gained weight since his repatriation, though he remained thinner than his pre-war self. Regular meals and physical labor had rebuilt muscle, but 8 years of malnutrition had left permanent damage, chronic digestive issues, persistent respiratory problems from mine dust, joints that ached in cold weather. He visited a doctor quarterly for examinations that confirmed what Wilhelm already knew. His body would carry war scars until death claimed him. The apartment Wilhelm rented had slowly accumulated furnishings and personal touches. He purchased a radio that provided company through lonely evenings, a bookshelf that housed volumes acquired from used bookstores, a small photograph of his mother placed on a table near the window. He had no pictures of Hans, no images from Stalingrad or the camps, nothing that depicted the 8 years that had consumed his youth. Those years existed only in memory. Historical accounts, including detailed analysis by German economist Werner Abelshauser in his work on post-war reconstruction, emphasized how rapidly West Germany transformed from devastation to prosperity. By 1951, industrial production had exceeded pre-war levels. Housing construction proceeded at unprecedented pace. The Deutsche Mark had stabilized, providing reliable currency after years of chaos. The nation was rebuilding not just physically, but economically and socially. Wilhelm attended a Veterans Association meeting in November 1951, invited by a co-worker who thought he needed companionship. The meeting took place in a church basement where 24 former soldiers gathered monthly to share stories and mutual support. Wilhelm sat quietly through the evening, listening to men describe combat experiences in France, Italy, and Russia. When asked about his service, Wilhelm mentioned Stalingrad and captivity, but provided no details. The others nodded with understanding. Some experiences defied articulation. He returned to the Veterans Association sporadically through 1952, finding limited comfort in shared experience. The organization's chairman, a former Hauptmann named Georg Schneider, had lost both legs during the retreat from Moscow. Georg spoke eloquently about moving forward while honoring fallen comrades, about building peace after knowing war, about redemption through reconstruction. Wilhelm admired Georg's optimism while remaining skeptical that words could heal wounds this deep. Wilhelm met Elisabeth Weber in March 1952 at the Gasthaus where he took evening meals. She worked as a waitress, a widow whose husband had died during the Allied bombing of Hamburg in 1943. Elisabeth had survived the firestorm that killed Peter Schmidt's family, escaping through burning streets while the world around her vaporized. She moved to Frankfurt afterward, seeking distance from memories that pursued her nonetheless. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual recognition of damage that neither could fully heal. Elisabeth understood Wilhelm's silences, his occasional distance, his reluctance to discuss the past. She carried her own ghosts. The sound of air raid sirens still triggered panic attacks. Heat from ovens made her nauseous. Summer thunderstorms drove her to hide in closets where the lightning could not reach. They shared dinners without demanding more than companionship, two wounded people seeking comfort in proximity. Wilhelm proposed marriage in December 1952, not from passion but from pragmatic recognition that they could face the future more effectively together than separately. Elisabeth accepted for similar reasons. They understood each other's limitations, expected nothing beyond what could be reasonably provided, and offered mutual support without illusions about romance or happiness. They married in a civil ceremony on January 10, 1953, with Georg Schneider and another veteran serving as witnesses. The newlyweds rented a larger apartment in a building Wilhelm's company had recently completed. Elisabeth continued working at the Gasthaus, while Wilhelm maintained his construction position. They established routines that accommodated both their needs: separate bedrooms to allow for nightmares that still disrupted sleep, quiet evenings spent reading rather than attempting conversation that neither desired, weekend walks through parks where nature provided distraction from memories. Wilhelm turned 33 in September 1953, marking 12 years since he had watched Stalingrad burn. The anniversary passed without acknowledgement. He and Elisabeth maintained unspoken agreement to avoid discussing their wartime experiences. The past existed as heavy presence that required no discussion, acknowledged through silence rather than speech. The construction company promoted Wilhelm to site manager in early 1954, responsibility for coordinating multiple crews on large projects. The position paid significantly better and required less physical labor, transitions Wilhelm's damaged body welcomed. He found satisfaction in watching buildings rise from rubble, concrete evidence that destruction could be overcome through patient effort. Each completed structure represented small victory against the forces that had tried to destroy him. Elizabeth became pregnant in summer 1954, news that brought complicated emotions. Wilhelm felt terror at the prospect of bringing a child into a world capable of such cruelty. But Elizabeth radiated cautious hope, speaking about new beginnings and second chances in ways that reminded Wilhelm that life continued despite trauma. They prepared for parenthood with the same pragmatic approach they brought to everything: purchasing necessary items, reading child care books, establishing plans without permitting themselves excessive optimism. Their daughter Anna was born on March 3, 1955, a healthy infant who screamed with vigor that suggested she would tolerate no nonsense. Wilhelm held his daughter for the first time and felt something crack inside himself. Not breaking, but opening, permitting emotion entry after years of deliberate numbness. He wept, as he had not wept since before Stalingrad. Tears that contained grief and relief and hope, all mixed together until they became indistinguishable. Fatherhood transformed Wilhelm in ways he could not articulate. Anna's needs demanded presence that pulled him from the past's gravitational field. Sleepless nights spent walking a crying infant provided purpose that transcended mere survival. Wilhelm discovered that caring for someone completely dependent forced him to engage with life rather than simply enduring it. The transformation occurred gradually, measured in small moments rather than dramatic revelations. August 17, 1960, found Wilhelm Hoffmann celebrating his 40th birthday surrounded by family in the garden of a house he and Elizabeth had purchased 2 years earlier on Frankfurt's outskirts. Anna, now 5 years old, chased butterflies through flower beds Elizabeth had planted with the same determination she brought to everything. Their son Thomas, born in 1957, played with toy trucks in the sandbox Wilhelm had built the previous summer. The house represented achievement Wilhelm had not dared imagine during those frozen days in Stalingrad or endless years in Soviet camps. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen where Elizabeth baked bread that filled rooms with warmth, a living room with windows that overlooked the garden. The mortgage required careful budgeting, but Wilhelm's income as a construction company regional manager provided security his younger self would have considered miraculous. Germany had transformed dramatically during the 15 years since Wilhelm's repatriation. The Federal Republic had regained sovereignty in 1955, though still occupied by Allied forces who maintained permanent presence. The economy boomed as the Wirtschaftswunder reached full momentum, creating prosperity that allowed ordinary citizens to purchase automobiles, televisions, and modern appliances. The nation had rebuilt itself with astonishing speed. Though questions about responsibility for the Nazi past remained largely unaddressed, Wilhelm had never spoken to Anna or Thomas about Stalingrad or the camps. The children knew their father had served in the war, information gleaned from overheard conversations rather than direct discussion. Anna had asked once why her father walked with a slight limp and why his hands bore unusual scars. Elizabeth had deflected with vague references to old injuries, changing the subject before Anna's curiosity could deepen. The Veterans Association remained part of Wilhelm's life, though his participation had decreased as family obligations expanded. Georg Schneider still chaired meetings, now focused less on war remembrance and more on supporting members who struggled with integration. The association helped former soldiers find employment, provided connections for those seeking housing, and offered confidential counseling for men whose demons refused to stay buried. Historical research conducted in subsequent decades, including comprehensive studies by German sociologist Harold Welser in works like Grandpa Wasn't a Nazi, revealed patterns in how Germany processed its Nazi past. The immediate post-war period focused on reconstruction rather than reflection, economic recovery rather than moral reckoning. Most veterans maintained silence about their experiences, creating generational divides as their children matured in a nation that preferred forgetting to confronting. Wilhelm received a letter in September 1960 from a Soviet organization seeking to establish contact between former prisoners and their captors for reconciliation purposes. The letter, written in awkward German, expressed hope that Wilhelm harbored no resentment and might be willing to correspond with Soviet citizens interested in healing wartime wounds. Wilhelm read the letter twice, then filed it unanswered. Forgiveness required emotional capacity Wilhelm had not developed. He bore no active hatred, but neither could he pretend the years of suffering had been erased by time's passage. Elisabeth had thrived in ways Wilhelm envied. She had confronted her Hamburg trauma through therapy, a step Wilhelm refused to consider. She spoke openly with Anna about loss and resilience, age-appropriate conversations that prepared their daughter for life's inevitable difficulties. Elisabeth had transformed from the haunted waitress Wilhelm married into a woman who acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. Wilhelm admired her strength while accepting his own limitations. The construction company offered Wilhelm a partnership position in November 1960, recognition of his contributions to the firm's growth. Acceptance meant increased responsibility and significantly higher income, but also required public speaking at industry events and client meetings. Wilhelm negotiated modified terms that minimized public appearances while allowing him to contribute through project management. His reputation for completing complex builds on schedule and under budget made him valuable enough that the company accommodated his preferences. Wilhelm turned Anna and Thomas's bedroom into a small library in December 1960, installing bookshelves and filling them with volumes carefully selected to educate and inspire. He wanted his children to understand history without being crushed by it, to learn from the past without being imprisoned by its horrors. The books covered wide ranges: science, literature, philosophy, deliberately avoiding military history that Wilhelm could not bear to revisit. Christmas 1960 brought the family together in ways that reminded Wilhelm how far he had traveled from the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. They decorated a tree while singing carols, prepared traditional foods, exchanged modest gifts that represented thoughtfulness rather than extravagance. Anna performed a Christmas poem she had learned at school, her confidence and joy contrasting sharply with the childhood Wilhelm remembered, always shadowed by his father's death in the First World War. Wilhelm received an unexpected visit in February 1961 from Martin Fischer, the soldier who had brought news of Hans's death 15 years earlier. Martin had tracked Wilhelm through Veterans Association networks, seeking closure for his own demons. The two men spent an afternoon together, sharing stories carefully edited to exclude the worst horrors. Martin confirmed details about Hans's final days. He had died quickly during a Soviet artillery barrage, probably never knew what hit him. Martin thought Wilhelm would want to know his brother had not suffered. Wilhelm thanked him for this information, recognizing it as likely fabrication meant to provide comfort. The construction company assigned Wilhelm oversight for a major project in April 1961, a hospital complex that would serve Frankfurt's growing population. The project required coordinating dozens of subcontractors and managing budgets exceeding anything Wilhelm had previously handled. He approached the challenge methodically, applying lessons learned from years of solving problems with limited resources under impossible conditions. Stalingrad had taught him to function under pressure, though he never acknowledged this connection publicly. Elisabeth organized a small party for Wilhelm's 41st birthday in September 1961, inviting close friends and a few colleagues. Wilhelm tolerated the attention with good humor, recognizing that Elisabeth needed these social connections even if he found them mildly uncomfortable. Georg Schneider attended, arriving in the wheelchair he used for longer distances, and toasted Wilhelm's continued success with genuine warmth. The veterans understood each other in ways civilians could not, bound by experiences that required no discussion. Wilhelm stood in his garden after guests departed, watching stars emerge as darkness settled over Frankfurt. Anna and Thomas slept upstairs, exhausted from excitement. Elisabeth cleaned in the kitchen, humming quietly. Wilhelm thought about the journey from Stalingrad to this moment, about the men who had died so he could live, about his mother and brother who would never know the family he had built. The past remained present, heavy, but no longer crushing, acknowledged without being granted power to destroy the modest peace he had constructed. He had survived. Against odds that should have killed him multiple times over, Wilhelm Hoffmann had endured. He carried Stalingrad and the camps within him still, invisible wounds that would never fully heal. But he had built something beyond survival, a family, a career, a life that honored those who had fallen by refusing to surrender to despair. The victory was small, personal, and perhaps meaningless in history's grand scope. But it was his, earned through 2 decades of simply refusing to quit. Wilhelm returned inside to where Elizabeth waited with coffee and quiet companionship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did. But tonight, in this house with these people, Wilhelm Hoffmann had found something resembling peace. Not forgetting. He would never forget. But living despite memory's weight. For now, that was enough.